Hey kids, Jester here, and welcome back to the court. Tomorrow is November 11th, and over here in Britain that means Remembrance Day, or Poppy Day, or Armistice Day, depending on which is your preference for name. Now, just to explain to anybody outside of the Commonwealth, which is where Remembrance Day is mostly celebrated, for anybody outside of that area, I'm going to explain what it is. Remembrance Day falls on November 11th to celebrate the end of the First World War, but also to honour the memory of all those soldiers that died in service, specifically to do with World War I, but in practice now, it actually remembers anybody who's died in service ever since, really. Maybe not so much in official theory, but very much in common practice now. Hostilities at the end of World War I officially ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918? Yes, 1918. And so traditionally now, November 11th has become Remembrance Day to remember that fact, and we have a minute's silence at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month every year. And there are also services on the nearest Sunday and all that kind of thing. Now, the reason for the poppy, I recently discovered actually while researching this, is actually thanks to a poem called In Flanders Fields, which was written by a Canadian physician who I think was a field medic, he was a doctor, he was on the battlefield. That Canadian soldier being Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. He wrote the poem In Flanders Fields about the battles, the worst battles that happened on Flanders Fields, inspired by the death of another soldier and a good friend of his, Alexis Helmer, who died in the Second Battle of Ypres. I hope I'm saying that right. Now, according to legend, he actually threw away this poem when he first wrote it. He was not pleased with it, but other soldiers who had heard it or read it recovered the poem, and it became sort of a symbol for everybody. It was then used as a form of propaganda for selling war bonds and recruiting and all this kind of thing, which in theory sounds bad, but when you consider the actual meaning this poem ended up gaining in the future, it's actually pretty amazing. Now, the reason this has anything to do with poppies that we wear now in Britain and any other Commonwealth country is because of the amount of poppies that actually in real life, not just in the poem, grew on Flanders Fields. They grew on the battlefields of some of the worst battles, and the bright red of the poppy itself was such a meaningful piece of imagery when you compare it to the amount of blood that was spilled on the battlefield. So thanks to both the poem noting this and that being the fact, obviously, of these fields suddenly growing with all these poppies after the battles, they became a very important piece of imagery for the day that we celebrate, remember, whichever word you prefer. I know that celebrate sometimes has the connotations of good times. I'm not trying to say that remembering these men are bad times. It's a very honourable thing to do, that there is goodness in it. So yeah, that's why we have the Remembrance Poppy. This actually brings me around to another thing. Recently, when I watched the Rooster Teeth Extra Life stream, Lindsay Tuggy, one of their staff members, very, very nice lady, fiancée to Michael Jones, who most people already know more of, Rage Quit Michael Jones. She was wearing a grey sweater, cardigan, whatever you want to call it, and it had a red spot kind of here, it was part of the pattern as far as I can tell, or maybe it was a brooch, perhaps, I can't remember specifically. But I do remember that the Twitters was exploded with messages to her asking her if she was wearing a poppy for Remembrance Day. And while I was watching this, I initially thought, oh, that's really nice, Lindsay, until I realised, no, because the Americans don't do that. But again, while researching this, I did discover that the Americans do celebrate something on the 11th, which is very, very similar. Now, I didn't realise this about you guys that were watching, because I know I've got some American watchers. Your Veterans Day, which I did not realise falls on the 11th of November, but I didn't know existed, is greatly, greatly similar to our Remembrance Day. But rather than just remembering those servicemen and women who have died in the line of duty, you rather coolly remember all of them, including the survivors, hence the word veterans. Now, I like this, and maybe this is because of just my psychological bent or just my personal feelings on the armed services anyway. I very much appreciate them and what these men and women do, regardless of intent, motive, or end result. What they put themselves, what the situations they put themselves into. I feel really bad and less of a man. I can't do it myself. I like this because sometimes it's good to remember even those who survive. Because, and you can hate me for saying this if you want, but I truly honestly believe this. Sometimes surviving can be just as bad, if not worse, than not surviving. That's probably going to be a lot of people out there who don't understand that principle, or hate me for saying it if you have lost someone to the armed services. But like I said, maybe it's my psychological bent, because I understand that those who survive can often come back with severe PTSD, severe survivor's guilt, which yes is a very serious thing, and that's not even to mention the ones who come back having left limbs behind. Yes, they have survived the war or battle they've been in, where others have not, but for many, coming back home with these conditions, with these injuries, particularly when losing a limb, can often make life very, very difficult. I'm not trying to say that the ones that died are lucky because they've not had to stick around with injuries or whatever. Of course not, they've died in their service, and that's tragic. I'm just saying sometimes it's good to remember the veterans that have survived, because they have suffered as well. So that was something interesting that I didn't know about your Veterans Day. It's basically the same thing, same day, same reasons, you just take a very different view on who to celebrate, thanks to what's happened. And I like that. I do, I like that. Now, over here in Britain, I'm not sure if you Americans practice this tradition, but over here in Britain, we have a minute's silence. Traditionally on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, which would, for me, right now, would be tomorrow, in about 20 hours time. But because this video comes out today and not tomorrow, I wanted to practice this now with you guys, and I hope that you guys will stick around while we close out this video with just a minute's silence, and that's it. So I would very much appreciate it if you join me in this. It will literally just be me sat here for a minute in silence, and I hope you guys will help me honour all the soldiers around the world while doing this. Thank you. Thanks again, guys. I'll see you through the week.